For brands, media planning, and advertisers, Channel Africa is more than just a platform. It's an opportunity. With 25 compelling shows covering current affairs, sports, business, music, and lifestyle, we deliver an engaging Pan-African audience ready to connect, invest, and act. Multi-award winning, internationally recognized, digitally accessible across the globe. When Africa speaks, the world listens, and Channel Africa makes sure of it. For business, for culture, for Africa, partner with Channel Africa because Africa's voice is the future. Africa is a story, a living, breathing, ever-evolving masterpiece. And for over 5 decades now, one voice has told it like no other. Channel Africa. More than just a broadcaster, Channel Africa is the pulse of the continent, African-led, African-run, and deeply rooted in its heritage. It's the only international station that speaks to Africa in its own voices: English, Kiswahili, Chinyanja, French, and Portuguese. The languages that unite 1 billion people. We have been there through every shift, every milestone, and every triumph. Not just reporting history, but shaping the conversations that define Africa's future. For brands, media planning, and advertisers, Channel Africa is more than just a platform. It's an opportunity. With 25 compelling shows covering current affairs, sports, business, music, and lifestyle, we deliver an engaging Pan-African audience ready to connect, invest, and act. Multi-award winning, internationally recognized, digitally accessible across the globe. When Africa speaks, the world listens, and Channel Africa makes sure of it. For business, for culture, for Africa, partner with Channel Africa because Africa's voice is the future. Africa is a story, a living, breathing, ever-evolving masterpiece. And for over 5 decades now, one voice has told it like no other. Channel Africa. More than just a broadcaster, Channel Africa is the pulse of the continent, African-led, African-run, and deeply rooted in its heritage. It's the only international station that speaks to Africa in its own voices: English, Kiswahili, Chinyanja, French, and Portuguese. The languages that unite 1 billion people. We have been there through every shift, every milestone, and every triumph. Not just reporting history, but shaping the conversations that define Africa's future. For brands, media planning, and advertisers, Channel Africa is more than just a platform. It's an opportunity. With 25 compelling shows covering current affairs, sports, business, music, and lifestyle, we deliver an engaging Pan-African audience ready to connect, invest, and act. Multi-award winning, internationally recognized, digitally accessible across the globe. When Africa speaks, the world listens, and Channel Africa makes sure of it. For business, for culture, for Africa, partner with Channel Africa because Africa's voice is the future.
It is that time of Africa World Hour. Very good evening to you. Welcome to it. This is Channel Africa, the African Perspective. Let's get straight to it. Top stories this hour. The late former President Edgar Lungu was stripped of all his benefits, including health insurance, before his death. This was revealed by his family representative, Mike Gaby Zulu, outside of the Cathedral of Christ the King in Johannesburg, where Lungu's funeral was expected to take place. The funeral was halted by a court order.
This is an opportunity for us to tell the story, the great story of President Edgar, how that he lived as a president, served the nation as a president, and thereafter he was a person that was betrayed by the system, cast aside by the system, and And now in his death, they wish to come back and pretend as though they took care of him, pretend as though they were good to him, pretend as though he mattered to them, when in fact he never did.
And moving on, several people have reportedly been shot dead during protests in the Kenyan town of Matuu, about 100 kilometers north of the capital, Nairobi. About 50 people have also been injured as thousands turned out to mark the anniversary of last year's anti-tax protests. The BBC's Akisa Wandera has the latest.
Police in several parts of the country have been engaged in running battles with protesters, using tear gas and water cannons to disperse growing crowds. In Nairobi's central business district, demonstrators continue pushing toward Parliament, the scene of last year's dramatic breach, despite roadblocks and heavy police presence. In some instances, overwhelmed officers have been forced to retreat, with protesters in pursuit.
And moving on to the Middle East, the head of the UN's nuclear watchdog, the IAEA, Rafael Grossi, says it's undeniable that Iran maintains the industrial capacity and technical knowledge by its nuclear program. His comments come as Iran's parliament has voted to suspend cooperation with the UN agency. The BBC's Bethany Bell has more.
Mr. Grossi said his top priority was getting his inspectors back to Iran's nuclear sites to assess the impact of the military strikes and verify its stocks of enriched uranium. We need to return and re-engage with Iran, he said. Asked about the leaked US intelligence report, Mr. Grossi said he didn't like what he called an hourglass approach. He said what was needed was a solution that stood the test of time. He said there was a chance for diplomacy which should not be missed.
And we continue with the latest to the southern part of the continent now, where a 2-day workshop on national public health issues and institutes is underway in Harare, aimed at strengthening the regional health infrastructure. This is in response to the COVID-19 pandemic that affected the entire world. But Africa was the hardest hit owing to poor health delivery. Participants include health officials, government leaders, and public health professionals across Southern Africa. Regional Director of the Center for Disease Control, Dr. Lau Rick.
But specifically allow me to say these meeting themes is to strengthening information, knowledge sharing, and peer-to-peer mentorship in promoting healthy, equitable, resilient communities.
And finally, China's top prosecutor has vowed to stamp out the use of torture and secret imprisonment by the authorities. In a rare admission that such practices take place, the Supreme People's Protectorate said that it had created a new investigation department to stop unlawful detentions, illegal searches, and the use of torture to extract confessions. The BBC's Celia Hatton has...
For years, the Chinese authorities didn't want to acknowledge that some officials used torture to extract confessions or held suspects in secret prisons known as black jails. So in a rare admission that such practices exist and must be stopped, the Supreme People's Procuratorate said it had created a new investigation department to stop the illegal behavior. The news comes after recent cases involving the mistreatment of suspects shocked many in China.
Africa World Hour. Africa World Hour. Unpacking global headlines from an African perspective.
And that brings the time to 15 minutes past 9. A very good evening to you. A warm welcome to you. If you've just joined Africa World Hour, we really appreciate your time and your thoughts and your insights. Let's go straight to one of our top stories. We've been speaking about it for several days now. Legal and political storm unfolding between Zambia and South Africa over the burial of former Zambian President Edgar Lungu. Just hours before he was due to be laid to rest in Johannesburg today, a South African court halted the funeral following objections from the Zambian government, which wants to repatriate his body back to the state for a burial. But Lungu's family says that's not what he wanted. To help us speak about what's happening and what the impact of that is. We are joined by Zambian historian, political analyst, Dr. Houston Chiputa. Dr. Chiputa, a very good evening to you.
Good evening, thank you.
A very troubling set of circumstances. What is your reading of what is happening?
Well, it's most unfortunate that things have turned out in this manner. But be as it is, it's a human problem, and it's a problem that has to be resolved by human beings. Whichever way we look at it, we have to find a way of resolving it and putting closure by having our late president buried in a dignified manner. And for me as an historian, I pray that he be buried in Zambia and nowhere else.
And I understand those sentiments, and I also understand your diagnosis that it's a human problem, but it has to have its root in something. So let us further, diagnose the problem from whence it comes, because saying it's a human problem is very broad. The individuals that are involved, who are involved in it reaching the point that it has, where the Zambian government intervenes in the personal wishes of an individual as per his family, that he be buried under certain terms, is why we are where we are. And it is my understanding that it is because the government of Zambia has breached certain agreements on those terms that we are now at a point where his family believes that he should be buried in South Africa, and the Zambian government believes that he is a property of the state in the sense that they say it is in the national interest.
Well, correct. Yeah. What has transpired since, perhaps some say, the illness of our 60th Republican president, Edgar Chagwa Lungu, and his movement to South Africa in January, and the eventual demise on the 5th of this month. And then what has transpired thereafter, the impasse between the family and probably his political party on one hand, and the state, or is it the nation of Zambia, on the other hand. What has happened is most unfortunate. But yes, both sides have dug in their heels. And one would want to say that really Zambians are quiet, Zambians are mourning, Zambians are expectant that this be resolved in one way or another, so that they say goodbye to a man who ruled them for 7 years, a man who grew up in their midst, who was born in their country. That said, yes, the family wishes indeed have to be respected. And one who don't wish that the negotiations that have been going on should have produced an agreement so that we could put closure to this situation. But that has not happened, and it has ended up in a legal tussle in court there in South Africa. Well, maybe I wouldn't want to be prejudicial to what will happen in court. We would want, and we're anxiously waiting to hear what the ruling in court will be. And that is what both the state and the nation will abide by, I believe. And certainly the family, of course.
And Dr. Chiputa,
and I can imagine.
I spoke to Dr. Fred Member, the head of the Socialist Party, yesterday. And we were talking about precedents, legal precedents, and we were also talking about political precedents, which is what the Zambian government is using through its argument by the Attorney General of what happened to Dr. Kenneth Kaunda's interment and the state's intervention. Funerals are very personal things. There may be a lot that is embroiled in the final decision making, but one would hope that at the heart of it is abiding by the departed's final wishes. So the question is, why do you believe that the Zambian government is so invested in going against this?
Well, not necessarily that I believe the Zambian government is so interested in going against.
I'm not saying
that.
you, but I'm asking the question, why do you believe? Because it is clear they
I'm
are...
trying to answer. You see, for me as an historian, like I said at the beginning, if we say that President Lungu's remains are buried in South Africa, fine. We will have opened the Pandora's box as a country, because before we have had 5 presidents, all of them buried in one place. Literally, it's a national monument. And it's a specially selected place because it is right in front of a government house, the headquarters of the public service, where the Public Service Commission is, where the Vice President's office is, and several other ministries are there. So it's a special place, Embers Park. But we'll have opened the Pandora's box because what will prevent Kaunda's children from saying, after all, initially we had wanted our father to be buried next to our mother, so we would like to exhume his body and take it. What will prevent people from saying, President Mwanawasa had said, in fact, in his will, in his case, that he be buried at Teka Farm in his village. What will prevent the relatives from taking his body? Chiruba, who came from northern part of Zambia, Luapula province, what will prevent the relatives? So you can see how complicated the whole issue is. And going forward, Embers Park as a burial ground for our national heroes, our leaders, our presidents, will become irrelevant. So perhaps, I'm not speaking for government, but that's the way I see it.
Okay, let's engage with that. Relevance and the current situation based on the cases that you have just given. So are you suggesting that anybody who takes the oath of office of president, including their family members, need to understand that as a national symbol, that their own personal wishes in terms of how they want to be laid to rest must be put by the wayside when they take that oath of office? Because this is what the former president's family is saying, given what they point out as the humiliation that former President Edgar Lungu faced at the hands of the incumbent. And this is why they had very clear stipulations on if there was to be a state funeral, this is how it must be handled. So are you saying that as a historian, it is your belief, because of the uniformity that has occurred before, that anybody who takes the oath of office needs to understand that they're a national figure, a national symbol, public figure, and they need to put by the wayside their own personal wishes of how they need to be buried?
Well, we have established a culture, we have established a tradition where 5 presidents have been buried in that manner. In some cases, even disregarding the wishes of they themselves before they departed. And so that is the culture we have established. That's a tradition we have established. And
Does
that's
that
what
mean
I'm saying.
culture and tradition are correct? This is the question I'm asking. Does that mean culture and tradition are correct? The way that things have been done are correct, and therefore it ought to be continued. Is that what you're suggesting?
Well, what I'm saying is, since 2008, and with the burial of 5 presidents and former presidents, nobody has questioned that. Nobody has come around and said, we are not going to bury there. Of course, the circumstances under which the 60th Republican president died, Edgar Chagwa Lungu, are slightly different from the others. But at the end of the day, it's a give and take situation. And I would have wanted perhaps the initial agreement where government had agreed that there were certain concessions they would give. The family would also give certain concessions. I would wish everybody was able to abide by that. And I think by now we would have put our president to his final resting place, and then we would have moved on as a nation, continue mourning him. But that has not happened.
I need to latch on. And I need to latch on to something that you raised, and I'll be mundane enough to even quote what some have said about what history is. His story, her story. Are you saying that a person cannot write their own story because of those that went before them? Edgar Lungu made his wishes clear as a former president of Zambia. And I'm not making the argument that I agree with or against, but I'm asking you, as somebody who is very clearly stating his opinion, and as you say, as a historian, are you saying that history in its very nature has been made up of people who have conformed to those who have gone before them?
Well, not necessarily. Yes, people can depart from the mainstream, and that is normal in life. But where you have been part of that same legacy, that same tradition, but then when you depart, you want to be different, because President Kaunda was buried against the will of the family. And the person presiding over that funeral was President Lungu. And so it becomes extremely difficult, and I will say again, for me as an historian, for a person who insisted that the founding father, in fact, of this nation, Dr. Kenneth Kaunda, be buried against the will of the family at Embers Park, because that was in conformity with the culture we had set up. That was in conformity with the tradition we had established for ourselves.
So basically what you're saying is that he needs to continue as he begun, in the sense that because he took that decision to go against his Dr. Kenneth Kaunda's family and his wishes, that he cannot object posthumously because he himself made that decision. And then again, I also go back to the question that I asked, that are you saying that people who come into office at that level as president need to accept that their lives are no longer their own, that they are a national public figure and symbol, and they need to uphold, the requirements of that job?
Yes, indeed, because to a great extent, the president is a property of the state. Literally, there are movements, where they live, what they do, where they go, who they talk to. Everything is controlled. And it's an international convention. And so one would expect that even when they die, they would be treated as such. Okay. But the caveat here is the challenges that late former President Lungu had with the incumbent president. Perhaps that is what the family is using. But then in death, when we die, it's either before we die, we patch up, we bury the hatchet with those we might have differed with, or if we don't have such a chance, those that remain behind may have to do it on our behalf, so that we don't go into the grave with that grudge.
Very
African tradition normally requires that those that remain do come together and patch up whatever differences may have occurred. And that is why I believe that is the spirit in which the discussions, the negotiations must have gone between the family of our departed president and the Zambian government.
Very interesting thoughts, and I must thank you for your time and your candor. Zambian historian and political analyst Dr. Houston Chiputa on the ongoing dispute over the burial of former Zambian President Edgar Lungu. Thank you very much for your time, sir.
Africa in Business on Channel Africa.
The president of the Arab Bank for Economic Development in Africa, BADEA, Dr. Sidi Ould Tah, he is vying for the presidency of the African Development Bank, the AFDB. He positions himself as a fervent defender of economic integration and structural transformation on the African continent.
Well, I do believe that I have a 360 view of the development challenges in the continent with my experience from both the supply side and the demand side. But more importantly, my vision is to bring on board all the stakeholders and to have a holistic approach for the development of the continent and to develop partnership across the continent and outside the continent, bringing all the stakeholders together to work for one goal is to make Africa green for life and livelihood of the African population.
Bringing the African markets into your home. Channel Africa, the African perspective. In this episode of Channel Africa Conversations, Peter talks to Dr. Thulisile Buda, an academic, author, and an expert in indigenous knowledge systems. Join us for a compelling discussion on preserving African languages and traditions in the digital era. Dr. Thulisile unpacks the role of educators, explorers, and how technologies like AI can support cultural preservation, and challenges us to rethink how we honor African heritage. You can find the episode on YouTube, SABC Plus, and on our website, channelafrica.co.za. This episode is a must-listen for educators, creators, and change makers across the continent. Channel Africa, the African perspective. At the forefront, the most pressing issues on Africa World Hour with Tshepiso Makwetla.
Channel Africa.
At 27 minutes to 10, Sudan is facing one of the worst cholera outbreak in years, with more than 29,000 reported cases and over 600 deaths. Since the start of 2025, the crisis is hitting states very hard, like Khartoum, Darfur, and Kordofan, where millions have been displaced and cut off from clean water. This week, UNICEF delivered over 3 million oral cholera vaccines to worst affected areas in a race to contain the deadly disease. Joining us now is Eva Hind, UNICEF Sudan's Chief of Advocacy and Communication, to speak to us about the scale of the outbreak and the challenges on the ground, how this new wave of vaccinations could save lives. A very good evening to you, and thank you so much for joining us, Ms. Hind.
Good evening. Very nice to be here.
So sometimes we talk about facts and figures, but we don't really have the real lived experience picture of those on the ground. If you could just paint that picture for us, please.
Definitely. As you mentioned earlier, this is a very serious outbreak. This is an outbreak that's taking hold in several states here in Sudan, and it's particularly difficult for children. Children are at grave risk, and particularly children who are in displacement sites. In these sites already before the outbreak, life is very difficult. There's barely no access to safe and clean water. Sanitation is often poor, very limited number of toilets, showers, opportunities to wash or cook with clean water, very limited access to basic healthcare. So these are places that are already prone to diseases. And then when cholera takes hold, when people are very cramped, often in smaller tents or shacks, it really can spread very easily, and it gets very difficult for the parents to take care of these children. So it is a very dire situation in many ways, and often these camps are in places that are close to in and around the conflict lines where the fighting continues. So there's layers upon layers of issues that make life so difficult. This outbreak is just the last of these difficulties.
And I'm just thinking that people who are caught up in this type of situation have so much to deal with that some of these things are no longer a priority. keeping their children safe, keeping their families safe, keeping the families together, making sure that they have some form of nourishment, that generally takes top priority, and they become so used to living in conditions where there is no clean drinking water, there are no health facilities, that they make do with what they do. And I'm just trying to understand that under these circumstances, what are you finding? How are people just getting by in these dire situations?
This is a very good question. I would say that even in places like this, I think when we talk to the parents, whether that's a mother or a father, what we see are adults that are concerned of their children. They want to make sure that they are safe. They want to make sure that they are fed. They want to make sure that they are healthy as best as they can. And I think they'll do everything they can in their power to make sure that that happens. Whether that's taking their child to a clinic, whether that's a mobile clinic that we might bring closer to them, or whether that's then ensuring that they go and collect the water that's there. So I think this is the entry point that people really want to take care of their children. And it's then our job to try to make sure that we provide these life-saving services as best as our ability. And of course, there are challenges. It's not always so easy to get to these children and families, but we are here and we are staying and we are doing everything we can to get to them.
You know, I'm just thinking as you're speaking that often when we talk about public health emergencies, people often look to the unknown. And I think COVID got the lion's share of public attention because it was the unknown. But when you talk about things like cholera that have been there for decades, if not centuries, people, it becomes in itself mundane that, you know, it gets taken for granted. So the dangers of how serious cholera is, and also just telling people about the availability of vaccination. What challenges have you encountered, and where do you think you still need to cover more ground in the availability thereof of vaccines?
I think there are a number of challenges on the ground, and I think just to start with the availability of the vaccines, that there's a large number of people who are at high risk. We're talking about millions. If we just talk about children under the age of 5, it's close to 6 million children that are at risk. And of course, we are aiming to provide vaccines into these areas that are hardest hit. For example, you mentioned Khartoum State, where we've really seen a big surge in cases. So that's where we aim to go. But of course, this amount of vaccines is not nearly enough to vaccinate everybody. So there's a need to bring in more wherever possible. It's the same with then making sure that we bring close water to these people. And that means then in different ways. That could mean water trucking. It also means then supporting the system. So this is firefighting on two fronts. One being providing the emergency support on the ground, as well as then investing in the system that provides these services. So in practical terms, that means then providing water treatment chemicals to the water treatment plants that then bring the water to the communities. So this is equally important. And of course, we also encounter challenges when it comes to hygiene practices, that there's skepticism. Maybe there are, like you said, sometimes bad habits. And this is why it is very important to mobilize the community and empower the community and really have them on board as well to be part of the conversation, to disseminate these messages, to talk about, for example, about the importance of washing your hands. So it's not us just informing people or telling people, but really rallying the support from the community and finding the way to engage them.
But you know, in an environment where there is lack, it's not necessarily that people want to form bad habits, but because of the crisis and crises they find themselves in, they form bad habits. So we spoke about the destruction of infrastructure, particularly health infrastructure. I just want to understand what you, as UNICEF, are doing and can do to mitigate some of these circumstances.
Well, for example, let's talk about the access to water. So in some of these places, when there's, for example, the access to water is cut, and that can happen, for example, if there's an attack on a power plant. and that then disrupts the electricity supply to a water treatment plant, and that has an impact on limiting the access to water in a community. And let's say people then are not able to access that clean water. That means that some people are then forced to, for example, collect water from unsafe sources, untreated places. But I think if the option is there, and this is, I think, where we are trying to come in, I think most people would want to then access clean and safe water if there's an opportunity to go and vaccinate your child when your child is sick. So I think it is there, but of course there are challenges on the ground to make sure that this happens. And of course, this is a country where the conflict is now raging on for its third year, and it's also about looking into the system, how it's in many places it's crumbling and also needs support to continue functioning.
So let's talk about community healthcare support systems, but also other health partnerships, the role that they play. Could you just share a little bit more about your experiences?
I think they're very important. As I say, for example, if we're thinking about the cholera outbreak, I think this really underscores how important it is that we have all hands on deck. And UNICEF is one actor amongst many. We operate with plenty of local partners on the ground that then help us provide these services, that help us to get where we need to go. So it is, and everyone has a role to play there. Both the organizations as well as then community mobilizers that then mobilize people to bring their children, for example, for vaccinations. There are people who disseminate these messages. This could be community leaders. It can be religious leaders who then disseminate these messages. And of course, the parents, they have a role to play to make sure that they bring the children where you have vaccinations available. And if we're talking about, say, mobilizing on community level, some of this is then done, for example, sometimes there have been people who were hesitant to vaccinate previously, and then they've turned into vaccine supporters. So this is also a very valuable resource, and when they go door to door and then talk to their community and explain why it is so important.
So as I mentioned in the introduction that the Sudan is facing one of the worst cholera outbreaks in years, and it is facing so many other challenges at the moment. But if you're speaking to donors, if you're just even speaking to the general public, both regionally and internationally, to give them a sense of what Sudan is really facing, what would you say in words to not only help galvanize for greater funding, donations, but even political support?
This is a really good question, and I think what we are seeing here, this is one of the largest crises in the world, and the numbers are staggering no matter what we look at. For example, if we look at the internally displaced children, we are talking about more than 5 million. If we are talking about children that are facing severe acute malnutrition, we are talking about hundreds of thousands. So these are several things that are happening at the same time. Disease outbreaks, conflict ongoing, on very unabated level in many parts of the country. And none of this is making of these children. And we really owe it to these children to take action and take action now. These children are the future of this country, and we really need to give them the opportunity to access and fulfill all their rights, whether we talk about healthcare, nutrition, education, all of this. So this is about children.
Thank you so much for your time and your insights. I really appreciate it. Much, much appreciated. Eva Hind, UNICEF's Sudan Chief of Advocacy and Communication, speaking to us about what is happening in the Sudan at the moment, saying that there is urgent need for intervention with regards to the cholera outbreak that is underway there.
Africa, voici Abedi.
Oui, c'est moi.
Abedi est un passionné de musique dans l'âme. Il a un goût pour toutes sortes de musique et passe ses journées à écouter Channel Africa.
J'aime beaucoup la musique africaine.
Ok. Devinez quoi? Channel Africa veut aider Abedi et les mélomanes du monde entier à découvrir encore plus de musique incroyable. C'est pourquoi Channel Africa appelle les artistes africains à soumettre leur musique. Chers artistes, n'oubliez pas de nous fournir toutes vos informations pertinentes à l'email adresse musique@channelafrica.co.za. Les soumissions sont votre chance d'être entendues, mais elles ne garantissent pas une playlist. Toutes les soumissions seront soigneusement examinées pour voir si elles répondent aux exigences de notre station. Channel Africa, la perspective africaine.
Africa World Hour, unpacking global headlines from an African perspective.
Right, it's 14 minutes to 10. We continue with some of the top stories here on Africa World Hour. South Africa's Director General of the Department of International Relations and Cooperation and the G20 Sherpa, Mr. Zane Dango, says meaningful progress has been made on climate financing since the last Sherpa's meeting, with member states now being held accountable for their commitments. Dango was speaking at the opening of the third G20 Sherpa's meeting currently underway in the northwest province of South Africa. The gathering is being held under the theme Solidarity, Equality and Sustainability. Channel Africa's business reporter Innocent Samosa has more.
Inclusive economic growth and industrialization, artificial intelligence, data governance, food security, and the development potential for critical minerals, these are some of the key issues under discussion at the third G20 Sherpa's meeting. South Africa's G20 Sherpa, Mr. Zane Dango, is leading the review of the G20 achievements to date and exploring future directions for the forum.
In terms of the work and the progress, I'm delighted to report that our collective efforts are yielding significant progress. Out of 132 planned meetings, we have now successfully hosted 70. Most of the working groups have completed their third sessions, and many have already engaged in the nitty-gritty of negotiating what they would like to see in their ministerial declarations for the year. And I'm sure you've gotten report backs.
And this is what we can expect in the coming days.
Our discussions over the next few days are going to be important. The discussions here is going to provide us with the opportunity to refine our objectives. We'll get report backs from some of the working groups and task teams, and we'll look at how they align with the priorities we've set out, and to ensure that we do reach out for inclusivity and that we also reflect our own collective aspirations.
Amid rising geopolitical tensions and a surge in protectionism, UN G20 Sherpa Nelson Mafu says the G20 is making meaningful strides to ensure multilateralism remains effective and inclusive, particularly for global trade and cooperation.
Certainly, there is a positive momentum with regards to reinforcing multilateral cooperation at a time when it is very much needed as the UN celebrates 80 years of existence. And the G20 presidency under South Africa is contributing positively to this notion of reinforced solidarity around sustainable development and equality, because it is time to reform the global governance architecture, but also ensure that financing for development and climate action is something that benefits developing countries, and the UN is accompanying the South African presidency in that regard. And so we are encouraged by the momentum. There's a lot more work that needs to be done by member states of the G20 and others, and we're here to accompany that process, to advocate for positive change, and hopefully we will see that really materialize in the Financing for Development conference that is coming up at the end of this month in Seville.
However, Mafo says there is a gap regarding climate financing. Climate financing, are we making progress in that regard? What are the focus priorities?
There is a gap of about $4 trillion for sustainable development financing. And then when you layer on that climate financing as well, you realize we're nowhere on track to be able to achieve as quickly as we need to financing that will make a difference. So a lot of effort has to be done. The Secretary General of the UN has what he calls the SDG stimulus, which is to say immediately $500 billion dollars needs to be made available and mobilized.
Meanwhile, Director of the Ministry Global Institutions Unit in Nigeria, Ambassador Bibi Haman, says the country is calling for urgent action to curb illicit financial flows and push for debt relief across Africa.
As Nigeria, we advocate for the priorities set aside by South Africa and the G20, which also tailored to the emancipation of Africa. And also we call for the support for the deepening of measures to combat corruption, including timely return of illicit financial flows, and also including repatriation of any profit or proceeds that accrued, in this illicit financial flow that goes somewhere else from Africa to be returned back to Africa. And we also support the adoption of UN Framework Convention on International Tax Cooperation to ensure African economies are no longer shortchanged through tax evasion.
For Channel Africa News, I am Innocent Simosa at the third G20 Sherpas meeting in Northwest Sun City.
And we go on to issues about gender-based violence now, how it affects around 1 in 3 women in the EU, or nearly 50 million from the age of 18 to 74. Often committed by intimate partners, it includes physical, sexual, psychological abuse. An EU survey shows that 31% of women have experienced such violence in adulthood. Channel Africa's Michael Mbewe reports from Germany.
According to the Violence Against Women survey conducted by the FRA, the European Institute for Gender Equality and Eurostat, approximately 31% of women in the EU have endured physical or sexual violence. Women aged 18 to 29 are most affected, but many cases still go unreported. In response, the EU adopted its first ever directive on combating violence against women and domestic violence, which came into force in May 2024. The directive criminalizes several forms of violence, including female genital mutilation, forced marriage, and cyber violence, such as cyber stalking and non-consensual sharing of intimate images. While attending a seminar on freedom of press in Germany, I spoke to women from different European countries who shared their views on how GBV has impacted women in their respective jurisdictions. Xander Cantor, the director of Friends of Friends Foundation based in Bucharest in Romania that deals with GBV issues, painted a shocking revelation.
We do have a big problem with domestic violence. We just had 2 cases in Romania in the last 2 months of women being killed by their partners who were knowingly to be violent. One had a restraining order. The other, apparently everybody knew that he was violent against his wife. They both killed the women in front of their children, and nobody's actually doing anything about it.
She says equal representation in different positions of power is a pipe dream.
For example, in the public sector, women are not regarded as able to be politicians. So we have a few women who are in politics or public administration, unfortunately, and they have to fight a lot to be in that position. And they have to fight a lot of prejudice and a lot of misogyny coming from the men. For example, I think this is the first government we are going to have in Romania in the last years where we have only 2 women who are ministers. And it's an accident, unfortunately.
In a blatant statement, Cantor says despite EU laws and Romanian legislations, these are only on paper, as inequality is the order of the day.
Actually, no, I'm not satisfied. And yes, we are part of the European Union, which obligates us to enforce laws that are valid across all Europe. So we do have laws protecting women. We do have our legislation is aligned with the legislation in the European Union. But this is only, unfortunately, mostly on paper, because the reality is pretty different. Women are treated, let's say, not equal to men. We do have opportunities. You have to imagine that in Romania, work-wise, there are a lot of women who are running companies or who have management positions. So from a work perspective, we have opportunities to, in the private sector at least, to do a lot of jobs, and we're treated equally with men. Sometimes not with the same pay as men do. But we're fighting for that.
In Mexico, in every 5 days, a woman is killed or missing due to violence perpetrated by men.
Isabelle Arroyo is a journalist from Mexico running digital newspaper in Mexico City. Shares the Mexican GBV story.
I began telling you that we live a paradox is we have every 5 days one woman is killed or disappeared in Mexico, not because of the organized crime or because an assault, but because of the violence towards female. That is something that is a very important issue in my country for the government, for civil society, for political parties, for the media, and we are still fighting to change the social and ideological ecosystem that provokes that men kill women.
However, there is hope in Mexico because of a feminist group which is playing a critical role in line with the existing laws that hold perpetrators accountable.
Because we have a very good feminist movement that is now in law. So we have the crime called feminicidio. So that's not a homicide, it's a feminicide, and it's different and it has different protocol in the law. If you go to a police and say that you have been victim of harassment in a public bus, for example, now that is a crime, and if you succeed, the man that harassed a woman will go to jail. So that being said, that's in law, that's a big improvement, but that doesn't mean that the government and the system fulfills the expectations of these legal categories.
Meanwhile, in Costa Rica, in Central America, things are shaping up. Bricia Stefania Benel Yanez is a lawmaker in the Costa Rican Senate.
We have democracy, we have three powers of the judicial, legislative and executive republic. We are respectful of the independence of powers. We have gender violence, feminicide have occurred. It is something that is being worked from the institutionality.
Michael Mbewe, Channel Africa News, Cologne, Germany.
And finally, ending with this, the role of young people in shaping Africa's tourism future. It's taken center stage in Johannesburg, where the 7th Africa Youth Tourism Innovation Summit is officially underway. The 3-day event together brings together youth-led startups, tourism authorities, and policymakers across the continent. Channel Africa's Lebogang Mabange is there. That's how we end the show.
Bright ideas, bold ambitions, and a shared mission to transform Africa's tourism landscape. That's the energy driving this year's Africa Youth in Tourism Innovation Summit. With over 30 countries represented, the gathering focuses on youth entrepreneurship, innovation, and small enterprise growth in a sector still recovering from the impact of COVID-19. UN Tourism Secretary General Zurab says the summit is already producing results on the ground.
In just 7 years, it supported over 4,000 young people. It's launched startups, built networks, and helped youth pitch ideas to global markets. With partners like Cape Peninsula University of Technology and Namibia University of Science and Technology, we support the Africa Tourism Innovation Hub, a growing space for small businesses and future thinkers. All this aligns with our agenda for Africa, focused on people, planet, and prosperity.
Also speaking at the event, Emmeline Jerry Mburu Ndoria from the AFCFTA Secretariat noted the summit's role in bridging the gap between policy and private sector entrepreneurs.
It is also through such platforms that we participated in what we call the Africa Tourism Leadership Forum that is also run by ATP. And so this has brought to us, or has helped to actually reduce the gap between the entrepreneurs, and that's the private sector, and the policymakers in which we work with.
South Africa's Department of Tourism, speaking on behalf of Minister Patricia de Lille, emphasized the need to rethink how tourism contributes to economic inclusion. Here's Dr. Sipho Ngomane, Chief Director for Tourism Sector Human Resources Development.
Youth unemployment remains one of the greatest challenges
facing the continent. And while tourism has immense potential to generate jobs, access remains uneven, particularly for our young people. That is why we must reimagine tourism, not just as a leisure industry, but as a strategic platform for innovation, skills development, digital transformation, and inclusive entrepreneurship.
The importance of building a skilled tourism workforce was highlighted by Elsia Grandcourt, Director of the Africa Department at UN Tourism. She says education and technical training are essential for transformation in the sector.
As adequate skills and marketable profiles are crucial to respond to the evolving needs of the tourism sector, access to education and human capital development strategies are thus key to build a qualified tourism workforce with technical expertise, vocational and managerial skills, which deem paramount to innovate, modernize and transform Africa's tourism and travel industry.
Day one of the summit set the tone for deep engagement on youth enterprise, access to finance and digital transformation. As the event continues, young tourism leaders are not just networking, they are shaping the future of Africa's tourism economy. Reporting for Channel Africa, I am Lebogang Mabange in Johannesburg, South Africa.
Hotlines bring you fresh. Africa is a story, a living, breathing, ever-evolving masterpiece. And for over 5 decades now, one voice has told it like no other. Channel Africa. More than